She dropped undeniable facts, a buried police report, and a viral clip that exposed the cracks in Elder's entire persona. Within days, his campaign crumbled, donors fled, and his name became political poison. When a man profits from denying his community's pain, what happens when that pain finally speaks back? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At exactly 9 a.m., room 2268 of the Rayburn House office building locked into silence as the cameras went live. The title above the chair read, "The Influence of Minority Media, Truth or Division." But everyone in the room knew this hearing was no ordinary policy debate. It was a showdown. The room was packed wall to wall, reporters shoulder to shoulder, congressional aides frozen behind their tablets, and students gripping their pens like weapons. This wasn't just about media. It was about who controls the story of race in America and who gets erased from it. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered quietly through the left wing, dressed in a deep navy suit that made no attempt to soften her presence. She nodded once to the chairwoman, once to the crowd, then took her seat at the witness table without a word. Her hands were steady, her jaw locked. Across from her, already seated and adjusting his silk tie, was Larry Elder, broad smile, clean-shaven, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how to dominate a camera lens. He didn't stand to greet her. He simply smirked. In that instant, the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Two black public figures, two radically different ideologies, now locked in the same frame. This wasn't just testimony. This was a televised confrontation decades in the making. Larry had come to defend the conservative belief that racism was no longer the defining obstacle for Black Americans. Jasmine had come to confront that very delusion and the systems that allowed it to flourish. The tension wasn't spoken, but it screamed from every glance, every breath. Staffers looked away. Even the chairman hesitated before calling the session to order. The stakes were no longer theoretical. This was personal, ancestral, and explosive. And as both figures adjusted their microphones, a singular question seemed to rise, unspoken but deafening in every mind present. Who truly speaks for Black America today, and who is trying to silence her? The silence that followed Jasmine's entrance had been dense, alive almost, but now it was shattered by the distinct, practiced cadence of Larry Elder. The chairman barely had time to announce the speaker before Elder leaned into the microphone. Shoulders relaxed like he'd done this 100 times before. But there was no warmth in his tone, no casual preamble, no thank you for the invitation, just impact. He came not to testify, but to declare. And he opened not with his own words, but with those of the man whose worldview had shaped much of his rhetoric, Thomas Sowell. As Thomas Sowell once said, Elder began, voice even, clipped, "Racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and those who feel superior by labeling others as racists." The words rang out like a courtroom verdict, not an opinion. There was no room for nuance, no space for pain, just an accusation wrapped in academic authority. On the right side of the room, a few nods, measured, almost grateful. On the left, stillness. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her stillness was different, not passive, coiled. Larry paused, not to breathe, but to measure the discomfort, to let the quote hang in the air like smoke. Then he folded his hands in front of him and moved to the next blow, delivered as if it were a simple truth, long overdue. "The real danger," he said, "is not oppression. It's obsession. This country is not failing Black Americans. Our culture is." There it was, the pivot, from racism as system to culture as scapegoat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was a man who had mastered the art of making calm sound like truth. Without naming Jasmine, he turned slightly toward her, just enough for the message to be personal, but not confrontational. It was the kind of rhetorical control that made people believe he was reasonable even when he was erasing lives. "Take affirmative action," he continued, sold as justice, but in practice, a backhanded insult, a message that we are not good enough to earn our place without a head start. He spoke like a professor correcting a lie in a student essay. Cold, exact, patient. It teaches our children that their future is a favor, not a result of their effort. That pity is progress. There was no outburst, no gasps, just the uneasy tension of moral clarity turned upside down. It was sharp, surgical, rehearsed, and dangerous in its elegance. Elder's words didn't aim to provoke emotion, they aimed to invalidate it. He wasn't just challenging Jasmine, he was undermining the very legitimacy of the struggle she represented by painting it as a narrative of dependency, not dignity. But Elder wasn't finished, not when the room was still holding its breath, not when the cameras were still rolling. What had begun as a carefully constructed critique was now turning into a full-scale ideological assault. And this time, the target was unmistakable. He leaned in again, slower, more deliberate, with the self-assurance of a man who believed the most controversial words he was about to say would also be his most applauded. The calmness in his delivery wasn't restraint, it was strategy. He wasn't there to shout, he was there to reframe the battlefield. Black Lives Matter is a fraud. He said it without blinking. The sentence didn't need embellishment. It was a shot fired with deadly precision. No metaphor, no softening. In the crowd, there was a slight rustle, like wind hitting glass. Some turned to one another. A few aides dropped their pens. But Elder didn't pause to watch the impact. He pressed forward, already moving into the heart of his indictment. It is not a movement for progress. It is a movement that glorifies grievance. It teaches young black men to look outward, to blame, to rage, not to rise. He spoke slowly now, each phrase carved like a stone etched into marble. It was the kind of argument that sounded reasonable to those who never felt the heat of a police spotlight, the cold steel of a denied loan, the suffocation of being followed in a store you could afford. Elder's tone was clean, but his message wasn't. It reduced an entire generation's pain into performance, stripped a grassroots movement of context, and rebranded righteous anger as victim mentality. Then came the pivot, the moment when rhetoric became weapon. The problem, he said slowly, is not skin color. The problem is dependency. The problem is not the system, it's the collapse of the family. And people like Congresswoman Crockett, he added, his smile thin and calculated, have built entire political careers selling the pain of our people. The words were sharper than before, honed not to spark outrage but to plant doubt. He didn't yell, he didn't sneer. He simply recited a narrative that had been polished across decades of right-wing talk radio and conservative op-eds, delivered now in a room filled with both power and pain. His attack was designed to look like clarity, but it was a dismissal dressed as analysis, a betrayal of truth disguised as principle. For a full 10 seconds after Elder's final blow, the hearing chamber remained frozen. No shuffling papers, no whispered comments, not even the click of a retracting pen. It was the kind of silence that doesn't settle but tightens, the kind that demands someone speak, not out of anger, but out of necessity. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. They waited for her to retaliate, for a scathing remark, for a clapback that would trend within minutes. But she didn't give them what they expected. She gave them what they needed. Jasmine leaned forward with a calmness that looked like grace, but felt like gravity. She didn't touch the mic. She touched the truth. With quiet precision, she opened a single manila folder before her, not dramatic, not rushed. This wasn't theater. It was testimony. She took a breath, scanned the first page, then spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry. Steady, focused, grounded in fact. Black applicants are 80% more likely to be denied a mortgage than white applicants with the same income. She didn't embellish. She didn't look up for effect. She let the number do the talking. There were no charts, no graphics, just her voice and a mountain of unspoken history behind each syllable. She turned to the next page like a surgeon preparing for the next incision. Black mothers are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than white mothers, regardless of education level. The words didn't land with a thud. They cut, clean, clinical, a truth so uncomfortable it silenced even the usual skeptics. Jasmine's eyes never wavered. She wasn't just addressing the room, she was addressing the pattern. Black drivers are more likely to be stopped, searched, and detained during traffic stops, even when no violation is present. She paused, just long enough for the statistic to land, but not long enough for it to be dismissed. There was no drama in her delivery, only clarity. She flipped the page again. In education, black students receive harsher discipline than white students for the same infractions. The room had gone utterly still. Jasmine's voice was neither sharp nor soft. It was deliberate. Every number, a ledger of lives unseen. Every line, a wound no one had stitched. She turned to the final page. And in employment, resumes with black-sounding names get fewer callbacks than identical ones with white-sounding names. Then she closed the folder with both hands, slowly, like a reverend closing scripture. Not to end the sermon, but to demand reflection. She finally looked up, not to provoke Elder, not to win the moment, but to face the denial in the room with the dignity of the truth itself. Her expression was calm, her silence afterward, louder than any applause. Because what she had just laid out wasn't opinion, it was a pattern, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The final page settled back into the folder with the quiet weight of a closing file. But Jasmine didn't move right away. The room was still, not out of respect, but because something deeper had shifted. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't called names. Yet every line she read had landed with more force than any outburst. Still seated, still composed, she leaned slightly into the microphone, not to escalate, but to reveal. What came next wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reminder. Her voice was steady, low, and unwavering. The freedom you speak of is not the reality for those who are just trying to survive every day. There was no anger in her tone, only precision, the kind born from lived experience. Her words didn't just respond to Elder's rhetoric, they dismantled its foundation. She paused only briefly, her eyes sweeping the chamber not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous to a comfortable lie. Clarity. You could feel it. Every law clerk, every reporter, every staffer sitting up straighter, listening harder, because this wasn't political performance. This was personal history, spoken as fact. Freedom is not the success story of a single individual. It is how the system treats an entire community. She let the words breathe. No rush, no apology, just the truth, laid bare like a wound no one could ignore. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't arguing with Larry Elder. She was pulling back the curtain on a country that still believed merit could erase injustice. And she wasn't just speaking to the room. She was speaking to everyone watching who had ever been told that their pain was self-inflicted. She gave no theatrics. She gave America its reflection, and suddenly even the silence had something to answer for. But Elder wasn't looking for a policy debate. He was looking for a moment, and Jasmine's clarity had just given him one to twist. As the echo of her final words drifted into silence, he leaned back, folding his hands in that practiced way that made confrontation look like casual thought. But the tightness around his eyes betrayed something colder. Calculation. He was done speaking about systems and statistics. Now he wanted to speak about her. He shifted forward, lips parted in a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. The room had settled into stillness again, that electric tension that falls just before someone decides to go for blood. She talks about systems, he said, voice smooth, almost amused. But what she really sells is sorrow. The line hit like a slap across velvet, polished, controlled, and deeply personal. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he diminished. Every syllable framed Jasmine not as a legislator, not even as a critic, but as an opportunist, a performer, someone who saw trauma as currency. A few heads turned, some scribbled notes faster, others froze, as if unsure whether to lean in or look away. Congresswoman Crockett, he continued, measured and deliberate, is not here to solve problems. She's here to package them. She builds a brand on brokenness, a platform on pain. She doesn't mend, she markets. The words were elegant in structure, brutal in intent. He spoke them with the certainty of someone who knew his audience, or thought he did. He knew that in Washington, calling someone emotional is often more damaging than calling them wrong. And in a country that still punishes vulnerability, accusing a black woman of monetizing pain was a precision strike meant to leave no visible scar, only doubt. And then he leaned in for the finish. Not louder, not sharper, but colder. You don't fix division by talking about it every day. You feed it. You double it. And that's what you do, Congresswoman. You don't resolve the wound. You reopen it to stay in power. He sat back slowly, as if the matter were settled, as if the case had been closed. But he hadn't closed anything. He'd reopened something far more dangerous than political disagreement. He'd attacked the right to name pain, the courage to confront injustice, and the integrity of someone who had lived through what he preferred to debate. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't tighten her jaw. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she moved with the calm of someone who had long since learned that silence, when chosen with intent, is its own form of power. Without responding to the insult directly, she turned slightly to the chairman, her tone composed but unmistakably firm. "Can we play the clip?" she asked, her voice low but commanding, as if what came next wasn't retaliation, but revelation. The chairman gave a small nod. The room darkened just enough for the screen at the front to become the sole focus of every eye in the chamber. The screen lit up with a bright flash of white, then faded into the familiar branding of Fox Nation. Clean, polished, proud. The timestamp, April 2021, flickered in the corner, followed by the unmistakable voice of Larry Elder. There he was, seated comfortably in a studio chair, smiling with the ease of someone surrounded by approval. His body language was relaxed. His hands moved as if conducting a private joke with the host. Then came the moment, the sentence, spoken not in rage, but with a shrug, with ease, with no awareness of the weight behind it, or worse, complete awareness. If we're going to talk about reparations, maybe slave owners deserve some too. It didn't explode. It sank, heavy, slow, sickening. The words poured from the speakers and dropped like a lead curtain across the room. There was no immediate reaction, only the kind of stunned, involuntary stillness that overtakes a crowd when the mask is pulled all the way off. One staffer near the back looked down at her tablet, as if unsure whether to keep watching. A younger congressional aide's pen slipped from his hand. A senator to Jasmine's left exhaled sharply through her nose, lips pressed into a tight line. Even among those who had applauded Elder minutes earlier, something shifted, visibly, silently. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She wasn't watching the video for the first time. She had seen it, lived the thinking behind it, endured the quiet, polished cruelty that dressed itself in intellect and called it balance. What mattered now was not her reaction, but the room's, the country's. She sat motionless as the screen faded to black, her hands folded before her like a witness to a crime she could finally prove. Because what Elder had just called marketing pain was now exposed for what it really was, the comfortable denial of generational violence, repackaged as casual commentary. He had dismissed history in a sentence, and now that sentence had come back, not just as evidence, but as indictment. And in the silence that followed, it became clear. This wasn't about a political disagreement. It was about the cost of telling the truth in a room that was never designed to hear it. The screen faded to black, but the silence it left behind stayed, thick, motionless, suffocating. Larry Elder shifted slightly in his seat, the flicker of discomfort finally visible at the corner of his eyes. The once confident posture had tightened, if only by a fraction. Jasmine saw it, so did the room, but she didn't press the moment with a smirk or a triumphant glance. She didn't need to, because she wasn't finished. What had just been shown on screen was not the climax, it was the opening crack, and now she was ready to drive the wedge deeper. Without a word, she reached forward, pulled a thick manila folder from her briefcase and placed it on the table in front of her, with a calm that made the gesture feel louder than any voice. Her fingers moved precisely, not rushed, not theatrical, just certain, like someone unsealing a record that had waited years to be acknowledged. The room, already breathless, somehow grew quieter. Even the clicking keyboards in the press row had stopped. She opened the folder, revealing a police report clipped neatly to the top. The seal of the Los Angeles Police Department was faintly visible in the upper left corner. She turned a page, then another, and then looked up. Not at Elder, but directly ahead. Her voice came steady, controlled, but what she said next was a bomb wrapped in calm. "This is a police report," she began, "filed in 2015. The words alone didn't land. Not yet. But the tension in the room shifted again, tightening like a drawstring pulled slow and deliberate. It was submitted by a woman who was in a domestic relationship with Mr. Elder at the time. Her statement describes an argument. Her statement also describes Mr. Elder retrieving a firearm and pointing it at her. There was no gasp this time. No one dared. The air had become electric, paralyzed. The accusation wasn't being shouted. It was being read, quietly like a legal record. Because it was. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't editorialize. She let the weight of the documentation speak for itself. Let it spread across the chamber like ink soaking into paper. Elder's hands, once folded confidently before him, now gripped the edge of the table. Barely, but enough. Still, Jasmine didn't call him a criminal. She didn't demand outrage or cast judgment. That wasn't her aim. Her goal was much harder to refute, much more dangerous to those who trade in moral absolutes. She looked up again, and this time, her gaze met his. Not in triumph, but in challenge. Her voice dropped just slightly, softer than before, but sharp enough to cut the silence in two. "When you speak of family values," she asked, her tone measured, "are we willing to speak honestly about power and control inside the very home you claim to protect?" The question didn't ring out. It settled like ash. Slowly, painfully, unavoidably. No one moved. Even the most partisan listeners in the room seemed momentarily unmoored. Because Jasmine hadn't merely thrown a stone, she'd opened a door. One that forced the entire room to look inward and ask itself what it had been too polite, too political, too complicit to confront. Elder didn't answer. He didn't even blink. But his jaw clenched slightly, and for the first time since the hearing began, the confidence he wore like armor no longer fit. He shifted again in his seat, not to posture, but to retreat. Subtly, quietly, as if trying not to betray the crack beneath his polished tone. The chairman didn't interrupt. The aides didn't whisper. The press didn't dare type. It was as if the entire hearing had folded in on itself, holding its breath in fear of what might follow. Jasmine remained motionless. She didn't press, didn't gloat, because she knew this wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. And truth, when presented plainly, doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs to be heard. The seconds ticked by, and still Elder said nothing. Not because he didn't have words, but because none of them would protect him from what had just been laid bare. Not to the room, not to the nation, and most damning of all, not to himself. The silence inside the hearing chamber was deafening, but outside those walls the world was anything but quiet. What had happened in room 2268, Jasmine's calm delivery, the footage, the police report, and that one devastating question had already exploded beyond the marble columns of Capitol Hill. It hadn't even been an hour, but that's all it took. The moment the clip of elders suggesting slave owners deserved reparations hit the internet, it detonated like a slow-motion bomb across every major platform. By the time the hearing reached its midday recess, the hashtags had taken over. Elder Lomat, Masha Crockett vs. Elder, Shani, who speaks for us. They weren't just trending, they were roaring. On TikTok, clips of Jasmine's calm stare as Elder squirmed were set to audio like gospel sermons and protest anthems. On Twitter, journalists scrambled to confirm the 2015 police report, only to find it had been buried in court archives, never litigated, never followed up. Now it was everywhere. CNN pushed a breaking chyron. 2015 police report raises questions about Elder's past conduct. MSNBC rolled a split screen between Jasmine's quote and Elder's Fox Nation clip. Even conservative-leaning outlets couldn't ignore it. The footage was too clean, the soundbite too damning. There was no way to edit around what had just unfolded live. And then came the avalanche. Within 45 minutes of the hearing's peak moment, the Women for Accountability PAC released a joint statement calling for the immediate reopening of the 2015 domestic violence investigation involving Elder. The statement was shared by 12 different organizations, including the National Black Women's Roundtable, Mothers Against Political Violence, and Survivor Voices United. They weren't asking politely, they were demanding. Simultaneously, screenshots began surfacing of Elder's older interviews, clips and quotes buried deep in the archives but now pulled to the surface like corpses in a rising flood. One video showed him saying, with unnerving ease, "Women are less politically informed than men. That's not opinion, it's data." In another, he shrugged on a talk show couch and declared, "Systemic racism? It's just a hustle, an industry, a lie people like Jasmine Crockett sell to stay relevant." Each resurfaced moment was time-stamped, verified, shared thousands of times in minutes. And with each viral hit, the myth of Larry Elder as a dignified conservative voice began to collapse, publicly, irrevocably. Then came the first fracture from within. The Langston Group, a prominent hedge fund that had previously donated over $500,000 to Elder's exploratory campaign for California governor, issued a two-line press release. "Effective immediately, we are withdrawing all financial support from Mr. Elder's political operations. We condemn the values recently brought to light." That statement spread faster than the original video. Not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what many had suspected. The power behind Elder was never personal. It was conditional, marketable, and now it was gone. As the afternoon wore on, the backlash shifted from viral to institutional. Prominent law professors, political ethicists, and even former Republican strategists began chiming in. Elder's defense of slaveholders wasn't just offensive. It was politically suicidal. His remarks about women weren't just outdated, they were dangerous. His denial of systemic racism in the context of a live, documented congressional hearing felt less like opinion and more like contempt for lived reality. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She hadn't posted. She hadn't spoken to the press. Her team hadn't issued a single tweet, because the power of her moment wasn't in the spin, it was in the substance. She hadn't needed to trend. She had spoken clearly, calmly, with facts and control. And now the world was doing what truth does when it can't be silenced. It multiplied. Meanwhile, Elder's team scrambled. Sources close to the campaign told reporters that internal meetings were chaotic and panicked. One aide reportedly quit before the day was over. Others were instructed to begin reviewing all public footage from the past 10 years. But it was too late. The internet was doing the archiving for them, clip by clip, word by word, frame by frame. No scandal lives in isolation anymore. And this one was moving fast, far faster than Elder's team had prepared for. What began as a calculated attempt to corner Jasmine Crockett in front of the nation had become something far more dangerous to the man who initiated it, a public reckoning. A moment when decades of curated rhetoric crashed against the unyielding force of evidence, memory, and a woman who refused to be diminished. And so, as the sun began to dip across the Capitol dome, the question on every screen was no longer, did Jasmine Crockett go too far? But how long can Larry Elder last? Because in the court of public opinion, where millions now watched, replayed, and judged, not all silence is survival. Sometimes it's the beginning of collapse. The momentum outside the chamber had become impossible to ignore. Reporters were clustering in the hallways. Phones lit up with alerts from every major network. Elder's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. And the walls of the hearing room, once thick with ideological defiance, now pulsed with something colder. Consequence. He must have felt it. The unraveling. The shift. Because just as the chairman called for a brief recess, Larry Elder rose slowly from his seat. No longer defiant, just cornered. His fingers moved to the mic clipped to his lapel, and with a single deliberate tug, he removed it and placed it gently on the table, like a weapon laid down in surrender. But then came the last act, the one move left in his arsenal, the performance of victimhood disguised as principle. He straightened his jacket, turned toward the audience, and raised his voice just enough for every corner of the chamber to hear, not with fury, but with forced moral outrage. "This is not a hearing," he declared. "This is a public show trial masquerading as justice. His words echoed like a closing gavel, not from a judge, but from a man trying to reclaim control over a narrative slipping through his fingers. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was strained. People looked down. Some folded their arms. Others didn't react at all. But a few, those loyal, unflinching allies from his party, stood up behind him. Not many, but enough to make a scene. One by one, a small cluster of hardline Republicans rose from their chairs and walked out behind him, heads high, steps stiff, pretending dignity where there was only deflection. The click of their heels against the marble floor became the only sound in the room. No applause, no jeers, just the quiet procession of men and women refusing accountability and cloaking it in principle. Elder reached the exit without a single glance back, but the power had already shifted. At the table, Jasmine Crockett remained seated, still as stone. She hadn't spoken since presenting the police report. She didn't need to. But now, with the stage vacated by those who couldn't face what had been said, what had been shown, she reached for the mic, slow and intentional, not to strike back, but to name the moment for what it was. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "If running from accountability is what we now call leadership," she said quietly, "then I'm proud not to be one." The line didn't erupt like a cheer. It dropped like a gavel. Precise. Final. The kind of sentence that doesn't chase applause but earns silence. The kind of sentence that closes a chapter. Clean, unflinching, unforgettable. Jasmine didn't look toward the door. She looked forward, because she wasn't here to follow the theatrics of those who walked out. She was here to stay, to speak, to face the room that remained. And in that moment, under the harsh white lights and the weight of a nation watching, leadership didn't walk out the door. It stayed at the table, and it spoke the truth. The final syllables of Jasmine's words still echoed in the nation's conscience when the tremors began to register as aftershocks, real, tangible consequences. It didn't take days. It didn't even take 24 hours. Within 8 hours of Elder's exit from the hearing, formal petitions were already being submitted to reopen the 2015 domestic violence report he thought the public had forgotten. But this time, it wasn't a lone voice calling for justice. It was a wave. The National Bar Alliance, California Legal Women's Fund, and Justice Renewal Initiative filed joint motions urging the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office to conduct a review not just of the case itself, but of why it was never pursued in the first place. They didn't just want answers. They wanted a reckoning. The pressure spread fast. What had begun as a political moment had metastasized into a legal storm. By noon the next day, the California State Ethics Committee issued an emergency statement confirming it would open a review into Larry Elder's fitness to run for public office. The language was restrained, measured, bureaucratic, but the implication was radioactive. If they found credible cause, Elder could be barred from appearing on the gubernatorial ballot. For a man who had spent years branding himself as the antidote to liberal California, this wasn't just a reputational wound. It was a direct threat to his political survival. And then Elder struck back. Late that evening, under dim studio lighting and with American flags flanking both shoulders, Elder appeared in a 6-minute video uploaded across all his social platforms. The tone was familiar. Part preacher, part pundit, part martyr. He didn't mention Jasmine by name. He didn't need to. His script was loaded with every coded phrase his base had come to expect. "What we are witnessing," he said, staring straight into the camera, "is not justice. It's not accountability. It's a left-wing takedown, orchestrated by media elites and woke radicals who fear the truth I speak." He paused dramatically, narrowing his eyes as if peering through the lens and into the hearts of his enemies. "They couldn't debate me, so now they want to erase me." He called the hearing a show trial, echoed his earlier exit speech, and warned his followers that, if they can come for me, they'll come for you next. The video was designed to spark rage, to reignite loyalty, but it didn't, because something had shifted. The comments were different this time, not just the trolls and bots or the loyal few. This time, the doubt had crept into his own echo chamber. Dozens of replies began with, "I used to respect you, but," or, "This isn't the man I thought you were." Others were more direct. So pointing a gun at a woman is media spin now? Or, you said slave owners deserved reparations. That wasn't taken out of context. You meant it. The video didn't go viral. It didn't trend. It sunk. Major donors began to distance themselves, quietly at first, then with carefully worded press releases. The Orange County Business Roundtable, one of the most prominent Republican funding circles in Southern California, announced it would be withdrawing all pending contributions to Elder's campaign and redirecting resources toward candidates who promote unity, not division. That line hit hard, not because it was harsh, but because it came from inside the fortress. Meanwhile, late-night shows had a field day. Satirical news segments juxtaposed Elder's denial video with his past clips, each contradiction hitting like a drumbeat of hypocrisy. But it wasn't just comedy. It was cultural condemnation, the kind that reaches beyond politics into the bloodstream of the national psyche. The man who once styled himself as the bold voice of common sense now looked cornered, desperate, and painfully out of touch. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't smile for the cameras. Because her point had never been to destroy a man. It had been to reveal a system. Elder's collapse wasn't her victory. It was a mirror held up to a country that had long confused power with virtue and performance with truth. Inside Elder's inner circle, panic set in. Campaign staff began defecting. The political consultants, who once bragged about his immunity to scandal, now whispered about exit strategies. Some even suggested issuing an apology. But Elder refused. To apologize would be to admit that Crockett had won. And that he could not stomach. But the public didn't wait for contrition. Public opinion polls, once comfortably in Elder's favor among conservative and swing voters, began to nosedive. Within 72 hours, a poll conducted by Sacramento Register showed his favorability had dropped 31 points among independents. Even among Republican women, the support that once propped up his outsider brand began to falter. The hashtags hadn't gone away. They had become slogans, printed on signs, used in student rallies, echoed in town halls across the state. Crockett and Elder truth does not flinch. Power is not immunity. The headlines were relentless. Elder faces reopened inquiry amid mounting pressure. Ethics panel reviews gubernatorial eligibility. Can Larry survive this? And the answer, increasingly, was no. Because when a man builds his legacy on the illusion of invincibility, all it takes is one voice armed with truth to bring the whole facade down. And now that voice had spoken. The nation had listened, and the man who once claimed to speak for forgotten Americans now stood utterly alone, struggling to be heard over the roar of his own undoing. The fallout had reached critical mass. Elder's silence had become a shadow trailing him across every outlet, every feed, every political room he once commanded. The headlines were no longer about allegations. They were about abandonment. His empire was bleeding. But while he withdrew into carefully lit studios and pre-written statements, Jasmine Crockett stepped out into the sunlight, not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to reclaim the ground on which this entire reckoning had been fought. The location was simple, a small stone plaza just outside the Capitol, the kind of place where reporters gathered with more tension than space. No red carpets, no podium banners, just a wooden lectern, a few quiet aides behind her, and over a dozen microphones lined up like waiting mouths. It was mid-morning. The air was sharp, and every network camera was already live. The crowd was hushed, expectant, some waiting for a political victory lap, others for a mistake. But Jasmine gave them neither. She stepped up to the mic with the same calm she had carried through the hearing, not cold, but composed, not triumphant, but unshaken. She looked at the rows of flashing lenses, the columns of journalists scribbling, the sea of faces that had watched her stand alone against one of the most unapologetically powerful Black conservative figures in America. And then, after a brief pause, she spoke. "I did not come here to humiliate a Black man." Her voice was quiet, even, measured, but the sentence stopped the world. "I came here to remind us that when a person of color stands before the nation and denies the pain of their own people, and we remain silent, We are complicit in that betrayal. A gasp didn't follow. It didn't need to. The power of the words wasn't in their volume. It was in their honesty, in their naked, unflinching confrontation of a sickness too many had learned to ignore for the sake of appearances. Jasmine didn't gesture wildly. She didn't shout. She stood still, hands clasped, gaze steady, letting each word drop like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward with every second. She spoke of what it meant to survive systems that pretend not to exist, of how the most dangerous voices are not always the loudest racists, but those who wear the language of respect while using it to invalidate truth. She explained why silence is not neutrality, why professionalism can't excuse complicity, why real leadership begins where comfort ends. This wasn't about Larry Elder, she said, pausing just long enough to let his name hang, then fall. It was about the stories that don't make headlines, about the women who are never believed, the sons who are stopped, the fathers who die nameless, the data we cite, the pain we carry, the reality we live, being treated as exaggeration unless it screamed. One reporter lowered his pen, another took off her glasses. No one interrupted, because what was happening now wasn't a political speech. It was a truth reckoning, raw and urgent, disguised in the posture of a press conference. Jasmine continued. She spoke of generations erased from civic memory, of history edited to serve comfort, of how internalized denial was the most polished weapon of systemic oppression. She did not beg to be understood. She simply made it impossible to deny what was plain. We can't afford to pretend anymore. Not for decorum, not for legacy, and certainly not for the illusion that we're making progress just because one of us has a microphone. The wind stirred slightly through the plaza. Her papers fluttered, but her voice never wavered. She didn't have notes, only conviction. And as she neared the end, there was no crescendo, no chant, no rallying cry, just one final statement, simple and searing. If standing alone means I stand in truth, I will keep standing. And if that truth makes people uncomfortable, then let the discomfort do its work. With that, she stepped back from the mic, gave a single nod to the crowd, and walked away. No smile, no wave, no press follow-up. Her aides moved with quiet efficiency, leaving the cameras to focus on the echo of her words, not the sound of her footsteps. It was a masterclass in restraint, in moral authority, in knowing exactly when to speak and when to let silence thunder louder than applause. The next morning, front pages across the country bore the same headline in slightly different fonts. Some said, "Crockett speaks truth to power." Others read, "Crockett, silence is betrayal." But one stood out above the rest. In bold black lettering across the top of the Washington Post, "I did not come to humiliate a black man. I came to stop a lie." Below it, her full quote was printed, uncut. No edits, no framing, just the words as they were spoken. And below that, a question, written not by Jasmine, but by the columnist tasked with covering her. If this is not what leadership looks like, then what is? And for the first time in a long time, no one had an answer strong enough to drown her out. The echo of Jasmine's press conference hadn't faded. It had only begun to spread, not in sound, but in consequence. If her words inside the Capitol had cracked open the room, her words outside it cracked open the country. What started as a confrontation with one man had become a confrontation with a question far larger, far older, and far more uncomfortable. Who gets to speak for the oppressed, and who decides when the conversation is over? Across the nation, institutions began to stir, not just in politics, but in pulpits, classrooms, and television studios. This was no longer about Larry Elder. This was about America's need to believe that if a person of color succeeds, then the system must be fair. Universities were the first to move. Within 48 hours, over a dozen of the most respected institutions, Howard, UCLA, Morehouse, Princeton, Spelman, Stanford, and NYU among them, announced emergency panels, roundtables, and open forums titled not with Elder's name, but with far harder titles, "When Success Masks Injustice," "The Myth of Post-Racial Merit," "Black Faces, White Narratives." Philosophy departments partnered with law schools, business students joined sociology chairs, lecture halls overflowed. Students stood in line for hours to ask questions, to challenge each other, to challenge themselves. In one standing room only forum at Harvard Law, a young black student stood up with tears in her eyes and asked, "If I get into this room but have to agree racism is dead to stay here, then what exactly did I earn?" The audience didn't applaud. They exhaled, because the line pierced deeper than a point. It uncovered a truth. In America, for the marginalized, success often comes with the price of silence, and Jasmine Crockett had refused to pay it. Churches followed, not just black churches, but white, Latino, immigrant, and interfaith communities. Sermons echoed with uncomfortable clarity. Pastors stopped mid-sermon to acknowledge the contradiction many had ignored for years, that some of the most polished voices in the public square are rewarded not for telling the truth, but for making it easier to ignore. In Baptist sanctuaries in Georgia, elders stood beside teenage activists and asked, "What does redemption mean when we still reward denial?" Congregations wept. Others nodded. Some sat in stillness because words no longer held shape around the guilt. Meanwhile, talk shows, normally reserved for light banter and celebrity feuds, shifted tone. Producers reached out to professors, trauma specialists, survivors of police violence, black historians. Viewers tuned in expecting controversy, and instead were handed a mirror. On one primetime segment, a host asked, "Does individual success give someone the right to invalidate systemic pain?" A panelist replied, flatly, "If it does, then we have replaced justice with branding." But it wasn't just the public figures who spoke now. It was the people watching. Teachers, bus drivers, mothers, soldiers, students. One letter stood out among the thousands that arrived at Jasmine Crockett's office that week. It came from a third-year student at Jackson State University. The handwriting was uneven, written on ruled notebook paper with the corner torn from a binder. There were no hashtags, no slogans, just a message that felt like it came from the soul of the country itself. You didn't just expose a man. You opened a wound this country pretended had already healed. We didn't need more debates. We needed someone brave enough to stop pretending. The letter was placed on Jasmine's desk by a staffer who had been crying when she read it. Jasmine didn't read it right away. She waited until her office was empty, the hallway quiet, the press long gone. She opened the letter slowly, sat back in her chair, and let the words settle in her chest like truth she had always known, but never expected to hear said back to her. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't applause. It was recognition. And that, more than headlines, more than polls, more than any political victory, was the thing that reminded her why she had done what she did. Not to win, not to destroy, but to tell the truth in a place that punishes it. In the weeks that followed, even as political strategists scrambled to reposition, even as elders' defenders tried to reframe the hearing as a media ambush, the questions Jasmine had forced into the spotlight refused to disappear. Does rising above the system mean the system worked, or that you survived it? Do polished success stories excuse the millions still silenced beneath them? Is representation real if it only reflects what those in power want to hear? And in every forum, every pew, every living room debate, one question kept rising above the noise. Raw, electric, unresolved. Who speaks for us? And in that silence, more voices began to rise. Not as replacements, but as answers. It didn't explode all at once. It spread, slowly, precisely, and with a force that no news cycle could contain. What Jasmine Crockett unleashed wasn't just a moment of political reckoning. It was a cultural shift, a tectonic adjustment in the way America spoke about race, power, and truth. It started with voices, not loud ones, not famous ones, but voices that had waited far too long to be heard. In a small classroom in Oakland, a high school senior stood up during a civics presentation and said, "I'm tired of being told the system isn't broken just because someone managed to climb out of it." The room fell silent, not because she was wrong, but because no one had ever dared say it so clearly. In Baltimore, a city bus driver wrote, "We see you, Jasmine," in sidewalk chalk outside a polling station. It lasted 3 days before it rained, but by then, the photo had gone viral. In Milwaukee, during a heated town hall, A single black father stood and said, "I'm not asking for anyone to carry my pain. I'm asking you to stop denying it exists." He sat down. The room didn't clap. They listened. What began as isolated echoes soon converged into something larger, a movement without a name, without a logo, but with momentum. From Denver to Atlanta, from inner-city classrooms to rural union halls, the same questions were being asked. Who gets to speak for us? And at what cost? Universities across the country responded first. Within 72 hours, nearly 24 top-tier institutions, Howard, Princeton, Morehouse, UCLA, Stanford, and Spelman among them, launched emergency symposiums. They weren't organized around Elder's name. They were built around the fracture he represented. Titles of forums read like indictments. When representation becomes a mask, success versus solidarity, and the weaponization of identity. Lecture halls filled. Overflow rooms filled faster. Students stood in doorways just to hear someone say what they'd known all along, that not every voice that looks like us speaks for us. In one packed auditorium at Columbia University, a law professor placed a single exam question on the final test. Compare and contrast performative representation and moral accountability. Use the Crockett elder confrontation as your framework. Students didn't just answer it. They wrote essays like declarations. Some cried while typing. In Atlanta, a Baptist pastor opened his Sunday sermon with 10 seconds of silence, followed by one sentence. To speak comfort without acknowledging pain is to preach to ghosts. Congregants wept. No choir, no pageantry, just truth. Churches, black and white, Catholic and Unitarian, joined the discourse. In Houston, a coalition of interfaith leaders rewrote their annual statement on justice to include a single line. Success in the house of injustice is not freedom, it's captivity with privileges. Talk shows shifted overnight. On The View, on The Daily Show, on Real Time, hosts didn't talk about Elder's downfall. They asked deeper questions. Does personal achievement cancel out collective trauma? If you rise within a rigged system, do you owe it silence or truth? Can blackness be weaponized to undermine black dignity? In community centers and barbershops, in bodegas and college radio stations, a new kind of debate emerged, not one of left versus right, but truth versus convenience. Elders were challenged by teenagers. Teachers were challenged by students. Fathers were challenged by daughters. One question kept rising like smoke. Does survival in the system prove it works, or prove you're exceptional enough to endure what others can't? And Jasmine? She stayed quiet, not in retreat, but in respect. She didn't book speaking tours. She didn't headline rallies. She let the country talk because the moment was no longer about her voice. It was about the chorus she had freed. Letters poured into her office, thousands, many handwritten, many from people who had never written a politician before. One from a 72-year-old retired steelworker read, "I lived my whole life thinking I had to be grateful just for surviving. But you reminded me survival isn't the same as justice." Another came from a 19-year-old nursing student. "My mother told me to stay quiet in classrooms when race comes up because it's safer. But now I think maybe the safest thing I can do is finally speak." But the letter that Jasmine read last and kept in her coat pocket for weeks came without a return address, folded 4 times, 5 lines only. "I watched you. You didn't flinch. I've flinched my whole life. Now I won't. Thank you. Keep standing." She read it alone, in her office late at night. No cameras, no aides. She folded it slowly and slid it into the same drawer where she had placed the first letter, written weeks earlier by a Jackson State student who told her, "You opened a wound this country stopped treating." They weren't fan mail. They were field notes from a generation waking up. Meanwhile, the movement expanded in shape, not structure. It didn't call for boycotts. It called for new definitions of truth, of leadership, of what it means to be qualified to speak for others. College campuses created new policy around speaker invitations. Nonprofit boards began drafting ethics and representation clauses. Companies revised their diversity guidelines, not just asking who they hired, but why. And Larry Elder? He faded, not from censorship, but from relevance. His podcast numbers collapsed. Conservative networks quietly removed him from panel invites. Former allies referred to him only in the past tense. But what hurt most wasn't the exclusion. It was the absence of deference. The realization that the same audiences who once leaned in when he spoke now looked away. His brand had not been destroyed by scandal. It had been unraveled by clarity, a clarity too many had waited too long to see. Still, Jasmine didn't gloat. She declined an invitation to deliver a TED talk. She refused to headline a Democratic fundraising dinner. When asked by a reporter outside the Capitol if she considered this a victory, she simply said, "Truth doesn't need to win, it just needs to be told, and then it will work on its own." And it did. Weeks later, in a high school gymnasium in Durham, North Carolina, a group of students held an open mic night titled, "What Truth Sounds Like." Dozens of them read poems, letters, spoken word. One girl, no older than 16, stepped up with shaking hands and no paper. She looked straight ahead and said, "I've always wanted to be heard, but I thought being polite mattered more than being real." Jasmine Crockett didn't yell, she didn't scream, but she told the truth. And now I think I can too. The crowd didn't erupt. They stood, every one of them, in silence, hands over hearts, as if bearing witness to something sacred. That was the legacy, not headlines, not applause, a new courage, a new language, a new standard. And Jasmine Crockett, without ever asking for it, had become the axis of that shift. Not because she made noise, but because she named the silence. And once she did, no one could unhear it again. And yet, after the fire faded, after the final headlines cooled, and the last clip stopped circulating, something heavier remained, something that couldn't be undone with a spin, rewritten with a press release, or buried beneath the next scandal. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a scar, a mark left not on the reputation of one man, but on the soul of a nation that had come dangerously close to mistaking charisma for truth, identity for integrity, and silence for peace. Jasmine Crockett hadn't simply exposed a man. She had exposed an illusion, the illusion that proximity to power was the same as principle, and that a polished voice from within the community could speak against its wounds without consequence. What she shattered wasn't just elders' credibility. It was the lie that success within the system means the system is fair. That's the first lesson. That justice does not come with credentials, that eloquence is not proof of empathy, and that just because someone looks like you, walks like you, or once came from where you came from, does not mean they still carry your truth. Jasmine reminded us that not all betrayal wears the face of the oppressor. Sometimes it wears yours. Sometimes it speaks softly, fluently from behind microphones, with practiced confidence and a smile that looks like progress, but tastes like denial. Sometimes it speaks on stages built for it, because the system always finds new messengers when the old ones lose credibility. The second lesson? Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly. It shrinks into the background, waiting for discomfort to pass. It smiles in the face of accusation. It calls for civility while ignoring harm. Jasmine faced a chamber filled with that kind of power, the kind that hides behind protocol, behind tradition, behind the myth that neutrality is strength. But she didn't play the part she was given. She didn't rise to outrage because she didn't need to. She understood something far more devastating, that facts spoken in calm defiance can crush entire narratives built on inherited comfort. She taught us that truth doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. When she opened that folder, when she called for the video to play, when she dropped that final line, if running from accountability is what we now call leadership, then I'm proud not to be one. She wasn't performing, she was enduring. And that endurance is the third lesson, that justice isn't glamorous, it isn't always victorious, and it almost never feels good when it's happening. It's slow, isolating, punishing. Sometimes you speak the truth and no one claps. Sometimes you win the moral ground and lose everything else. But you say it anyway, because the only thing more dangerous than speaking in a room built to silence you is staying silent. Jasmine faced what so many face in smaller rooms without cameras. The calculated doubt, the weaponized politeness, the practiced dismissal. They didn't question her facts. They questioned her presence, her tone, her right to interrupt a structure that had been designed to let men like elders speak unchallenged. And still she stood, not with fists raised or voice breaking, but with an unshakable posture that said, I belong here, and I will not flinch. And in that moment, she taught us a fourth lesson, one that goes beyond politics. You don't have to be welcome to be right. You don't have to wait for permission to speak the truth. You don't have to have the final word. You just have to say the one that matters. For millions watching, Jasmine became more than a witness. She became a mirror, a reckoning. She reminded us that not all justice arrives in robes. Sometimes it walks in with no armor except integrity. Sometimes it bleeds. Sometimes it weeps alone in a hotel room after a hearing where the world applauded. But she still felt the burn of being interrupted, diminished, overlooked. That's what justice feels like. It doesn't come wrapped in vindication. It comes cold, quiet, but honest. And maybe the deepest lesson of all is this. When we choose silence to protect comfort, we become co-authors of oppression. Not because we agree with the harm, but because we fear disrupting the room. Jasmine disrupted the room. She made it uncomfortable. And in doing so, she made it honest. In the days after, many wanted to label her hero, destroyer, revolutionary. But none of those titles mattered to her because she wasn't there for a label. She was there for a truth that had been smothered under decades of compromise. You don't need a pulpit to speak truth. You don't need an army to stand for something. You just need to refuse to leave the room when the truth becomes inconvenient. That is the lesson she gave us, not in slogans, but in presence, not in anger, but in unwavering clarity. A reminder that history doesn't remember who shouted loudest. It remembers who refused to be erased. And now when the moment comes for us, whether it's in a boardroom, a school hallway, a family dinner, or a quiet act of resistance with no audience, we will remember how she stood, not because she won, but because she wouldn't kneel to a lie. And that is how justice begins, not with thunder, but with someone who refuses to leave the storm unanswered. And if Jasmine's refusal to flinch taught us how justice begins, then the question now is, who will carry it forward? Because the truth she exposed cannot remain a moment. It must become a movement, lived, practiced, defended, not in hearings but in hallways, not in viral clips, but in voting booths, in school boards, in courtroom benches, in corporate meetings where voices are still measured not by merit, but by the comfort they afford the powerful. If you watched her stand alone and felt something rise inside you, anger, clarity, shame, resolve, then this is your moment too. Not to applaud, but to act. Not to echo her courage, but to multiply it. Because the system won't change because it's wrong. It will change because we force it to. You don't have to be a congresswoman to speak with conviction. You don't need a platform to tell the truth. You need only to decide that silence is no longer your shield. Call out the casual cruelty. Name the systems that pretend to be fair while rewarding denial. Refuse to celebrate voices that rise by stepping on the pain of others. Write, organize, show up. Refuse to look away when power turns its face. Because every time you choose discomfort over complicity, you honor what Jasmine stood for. And every time you don't, the silence grows stronger. This is the moment to shrink the silence. So ask yourself, when the room turns cold and truth becomes the threat, will you look to the exit or will you stay standing? Will you protect the lie or will you become the next voice that makes power tremble? The storm doesn't wait, and neither should you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside room 2141 of the U.S. Capitol, firebrand Marjorie Taylor Greene slams a top-secret classified dossier onto the desk, swearing 6 brutal assaults prove transgender students are turning schools into war zones. Unflinching Jasmine Crockett waits a single heartbeat, then detonates the moment, holding up the unedited file in a bombshell email chain that exposes the stats as lobbyist-forged fiction. Lenses zoom as Green's gavel rattles like a gun misfiring, her color drains, and in 15 breath-snatching seconds her crusade implodes on live TV. Credibility disintegrated, career hanging by a thread. If one counterfeit document can obliterate a congressional powerhouse this fast, what explosive secrets are still ticking beneath the marble floors of Washington? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Room 2141 didn't feel like a hearing room. It felt like a trap. The polished mahogany table gleamed under cold light, sterile as a surgical bay. Marjorie Taylor Greene sat at the head, posture rigid, gavel ready like a loaded weapon. Her aides whispered and adjusted cameras, not for truth, but performance. On paper, it was a hearing on school safety and gender in federal education policy. In practice, it was a stage set for political blood sport. Down the table, Jasmine Crockett sat alone, silent, still, unreadable. No theatrics, no entourage, just a folder, a pen, and eyes that didn't blink. Rumors swirled that she carried a sealed document, something powerful enough to detonate beneath Green's narrative, but she made no move to reveal it. Not yet. The press sensed it. Cameras blinked red. Reporters scribbled without knowing why, only that something was about to break. 2 hours before the hearing, Politico dropped an exclusive. Leaked emails from Green's office revealing she had personally pushed to defund LGBTQ+ student support services from the Department of Education's mental health budget. The emails were dated, stamped, confirmed. But no one on the Hill had addressed it, not yet. Staffers were whispering. Committee members were checking their phones under the table. And Green? She hadn't even flinched. Not because she wasn't aware, but because she was betting on one thing: silence. But Jasmine Crockett had built her life on breaking silence. She wasn't here to watch the fire. She was here to strike the match. The silence didn't last long, because Marjorie Taylor Greene had no intention of letting it. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to lead. It was to ignite. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. What she lacked in volume, she made up for in venom. We are here today because safety in American schools is no longer guaranteed. She began, each word clipped, measured, devoid of warmth. Not when biological males are allowed to enter girls' locker rooms, dominate girls' sports, and silence real female students who are too afraid to speak up. Her cadence was deliberate, punctuated by soft taps of her fingers against the desk, like a countdown. She spoke as if she were reading from a script written in fear, not fact. Every phrase designed to paint inclusion as intrusion. Every sentence calculated to trigger discomfort, not dialogue. 6 incidents in 3 months, she continued, lifting a sheet of paper filled with highlighted headlines. Assaults, injuries, trauma, and all under the false banner of inclusivity. There was no context, no verification, just numbers, stripped from source, weaponized through repetition. No one interrupted her, but no one leaned in either. Even those on her side of the aisle watched carefully now, wary of how far she might go. Her tone was steady, but there was something brittle in it too, something desperate to reclaim a narrative that had already begun to slip. She knew this was her moment to set the stage, and she would burn the floor if it meant keeping the spotlight. Then came the shift. Green lowered the paper, her eyes scanning the room, not to connect, but to target. Her gaze swept left, then locked like a laser on Jasmine Crockett. The pause was calculated. Then came the line, sharp and unmistakable. And let's be honest, it's not just the policies, it's the people pushing them. She leaned forward, letting the silence stretch a second too long before delivering the blow. We can't let certain voices in this room, who constantly scream equality, turn this nation into a playground for chaos. The air in the room constricted, not with gasps or shouts, but with that quiet recoil that comes when everyone senses a line has just been crossed. It wasn't a critique, it was a provocation. It wasn't about safety, it was about silencing. And everyone in the room knew exactly who she meant. Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet, but her hand moved, calmly, deliberately, reaching for her pen like a swordsman reaching for steel. She didn't blink, didn't shift, But her stillness said more than words ever could. "You've fired your shot. Now watch what comes next." But Green wasn't finished, because when intimidation didn't land, she reached for something far more dangerous. Fabrication dressed as fact. With a calculated pause, Green reached beneath her stack of prepared notes and lifted a thin manila folder marked in bold red, "Confidential." She didn't announce it immediately. She let the sight of that word do the talking. The room reacted like a wound being pressed. Eyebrows lifted. Phones clicked on. Her staff, carefully planted along the wall, exchanged subtle glances. She tapped the folder once against the table, letting the sound echo through the silence like a warning shot. Then she raised it with both hands and declared, "This is a Department of Education briefing. Restricted circulation, confirming growing concerns about trans students in federally funded schools." The sentence dropped like a weight into the room. There was no verification, no accompanying cover page, just a flash of red ink, bold headers, and heavy black redactions, meant to create the illusion of depth where none existed. She opened the folder theatrically, revealing a page lined with cherry-picked phrases underlined in highlighter: increased disruption, parental outrage, loss of trust. She held it up like gospel, yet never offered to share the source. "I was told not to share this," she added, her tone slipping into mock defiance. "But the American people deserve to know." What she didn't say, what she hoped no one would say, was that the page bore no official stamp, no agency letterhead, and no sign of chain of custody authentication. It wasn't a leak, it was a plant. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her face didn't shift. But beneath her stillness, a storm was quietly coiling. Her eyes moved, scanning the page Green held aloft, not with panic, but with precision. One blink, two, then nothing. She simply waited, one hand resting on her folder, the other near her pen, but unmoved. The silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. Across the room, reporters began whispering. One journalist from Reuters leaned toward a colleague at NPR, mouthing, "That doesn't look real." A producer for C-SPAN checked the government database on her tablet and frowned. Even a few Republican aides were beginning to shift uneasily in their seats, wondering what, exactly, Green had just placed into the record. But Green was too deep into her monologue to notice, or too committed to care. She drew herself taller, her voice growing sharper as she turned toward Jasmine. "This document shows exactly what happens when ideology replaces policy, when feelings override facts, when people like Ms. Crockett," she paused, pointing now, deliberate and direct, "inject identity politics into spaces meant for learning." The accusation wasn't veiled. It was a public strike designed to humiliate. Green had just fired a shot meant to wound in public, but what followed wasn't retaliation. It was silence. And somehow that made it more terrifying. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at Green. Instead, she slowly returned her attention to the folder in front of her, flipping a page with the kind of quiet precision that only sharpened the tension in the room. She picked up her pen, not hurriedly, but like a surgeon selecting a scalpel. She began to write, methodically, with no visible reaction, as if Green's entire tirade hadn't just been hurled at her. Every few seconds, she looked up, not at Green, not at the cameras, just a slow, searching glance across the committee dais, as if reading the measure of a room that hadn't realized it was already failing its own integrity. Her silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was control, and that terrified people more than any rebuttal ever could. Behind Green, a few of her supporters began to whisper. One leaned in close and muttered, "Why isn't she saying anything?" Another replied, low and nervous, "She's waiting for something." Even the air seemed to thicken. Staffers glanced at each other. Reporters shifted in their seats. The press pit, once full of quiet clicks and scrolling fingers, had gone still. All eyes drifted from Green's performance to Crockett's restraint. The lens operators adjusted, gently, instinctively, zooming in on Jasmine, not for drama, but for anticipation. Because in a room where outrage had just been weaponized, her calm looked like the fuse before an explosion. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of an old clock on the back wall echoed through the chamber like a countdown, not to chaos, but to clarity. It was one of those antique congressional relics, its ticking usually drowned out by crosstalk and commotion, but now it sounded like a war drum. Time wasn't on Green's side anymore. It belonged to the silence, to the stillness, to Jasmine Crockett, who hadn't spoken a word, but had already shifted the entire room just by refusing to play the game. The room was holding its breath, but it was Jasmine who broke the silence, not with words, but with a simple, deliberate motion that changed everything. Jasmine raised her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, but with the calm assurance of someone who knew she didn't need permission, only timing. Her fingers barely moved above her folder, but the motion cut through the air like a scalpel. All eyes turned. Green froze for a split second, her smirk flickering. Then came the response, tight-lipped, half-laughed, laced with contempt. "We're operating under a tight schedule today." The dismissal wasn't procedural, it was personal. But even before Jasmine could respond, a soft voice from behind the dais intervened. A congressional attorney, seated just off-camera, leaned forward and quietly reminded the chair, "Ms. Crockett is entitled to time under Rule 11, Section 2. Green's jaw twitched. She didn't look at the lawyer. She didn't look at Jasmine. She looked straight ahead, blinked twice, and muttered, "Fine." The word hung heavy in the air, conceded, not granted. And the second it left Green's mouth, the entire chamber shifted. Camera operators moved in near unison, pivoting toward Jasmine like predators tracking the only movement that mattered. Reporters sat up straighter, pens poised. Even the ambient hum of the room changed, from chaos held at bay to anticipation pressed to the edge. Jasmine didn't thank her. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just straightened her papers, folded her hands, and waited for the microphone to glow green. The moment wasn't loud, but it belonged to her now, and everyone knew it. As Jasmine silently claimed the floor, the camera light still warming her skin, something shifted behind Green. Quietly, but with the weight of an incoming collapse. A young aide moved swiftly behind the chair, half bent, face pale, gripping a folded slip of paper like it was radioactive. He didn't speak aloud, just slipped it into Green's waiting hand with the speed of someone trying not to be noticed. She unfolded it beneath the desk, eyes scanning the short sentence printed in tight, urgent font. "They've confirmed. One of the stats you cited was fabricated." Her throat tightened. A flash of heat bloomed at the base of her neck. She didn't look up. Not yet. But her fingers tensed, curling ever so slightly around the edges of the paper, as if she could crush the truth into pulp. She had spent the last 20 minutes painting herself as the voice of reason, of fact, of moral defense. And now, with Jasmine Crockett moments from speaking, she was holding a live grenade in the form of a correction. The camera didn't catch the paper, but it caught her reaction, the way her posture lost an inch, the slight stutter in her next breath, the involuntary twitch in her left eyebrow. Her supporters didn't notice it, but the press did. One AP reporter began typing faster. A producer at CBS whispered into her mic, "Check her citations. Something's off." And still Green sat, composed on the outside, unraveling on the inside. She couldn't withdraw the statement, not without looking weak. But if Jasmine had caught it, and Green was now certain she had, it was only a matter of time before the truth was weaponized and flung right back at her. The problem wasn't that the number was false. The problem was that the wrong person had just been given a mic, and she wasn't afraid of the fallout. She was made for it. The green light on Jasmine's mic flickered to life with a faint click, barely audible, but in that moment, it sounded like a starter pistol. Her posture didn't change. No grand gestures, no sudden movement, just a breath, steady, deliberate. And then her voice, calm as morning steel. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone gentle but focused, "but I can't seem to let go of one detail." She didn't rush. Every word was intentional, every pause weighted, as if laying down the foundation for something that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. Her gaze drifted, not directly at Green, but toward the folder still resting by her elbow, the one stamped confidential, now quietly burning under 1,000 watts of national attention. "The document you presented, who verified it?" The room, which had just moments ago been shifting in hushed reaction to the aide's warning note, fell utterly still. Jasmine's question didn't come with accusation, not yet. It came with the kind of careful inquiry that feels more dangerous than outrage, because it was surgical, and everyone could feel the scalpel coming. Green blinked. Once. Twice. Her lips parted slightly as if a reflex answer tried to form before realizing it wasn't ready. Jasmine didn't give her the release of interruption. She let the silence hang, tight, dry, and public. Then Jasmine flipped a page in her folder, slowly, methodically, the soft sound of paper louder than any rebuttal. Because I've reviewed every Department of Education briefing from the last 3 months, she continued, her voice unwavering, and I haven't seen a single internal document with the phrasing you read aloud, let alone one stamped confidential without metadata or origin. That hit harder than volume ever could. She was holding up a mirror, but not for reflection, for exposure. Reporters leaned forward. A few fingers hovered over keyboards, not typing yet, just waiting. One aide from the minority party's side stopped writing entirely and looked up, visibly tense. Still, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She wasn't trying to dominate the room. She was dismantling it, brick by brick. So again, just for clarity's sake, can you tell us exactly who authenticated that file before you entered it into the record? Her tone didn't waver. It didn't need to, because in that moment, what Jasmine delivered wasn't just a question, it was an opening incision. And the room, whether they admitted it or not, knew the bleeding had begun. For a heartbeat, the room stood frozen in Jasmine's question, sharp, surgical, and impossible to dodge. And when Green finally answered, the crack in her composure wasn't just visible, it was deafening. She hesitated. It was subtle, only a second or two. But in a setting where timing was everything, that pause spoke louder than any rebuttal. Green adjusted her chair, her movements no longer fluid but stiff, as though her body sensed the truth closing in before her mind could catch up. Her eyes dropped to the folder like it might offer her a way out. It didn't. Her fingers, once confidently tapping out her dominance, now fidgeted against the table, out of rhythm, betraying nerves she couldn't disguise. Then came the response, brittle and unsatisfying. My office collected it from multiple sources? The words hung in the air, incomplete, hollow, an answer meant to deflect rather than explain. There was no agency named, no date given, no classification acknowledged, just a vague shrug disguised as a defense. The weight of that non-answer settled over the chamber like a thick fog. Staffers looked at one another, uneasy. Several Republican aides avoided eye contact altogether, their shoulders visibly stiffening. A reporter from the Washington Post stopped mid-sentence in her notepad, circled the quote twice, and underlined it. The photographer behind her zoomed in on Green's hands, zoomed in on the tremble. Because this wasn't just a political stumble, it was a structural failure in real time, broadcast across the nation. Green's vague deflection still echoed in the air when Jasmine, without raising her voice, reached into her folder, not for a rebuttal, but for the truth she had been saving like a final arrow. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she moved with the same quiet precision that had defined her since the hearing began. Her hand slipped inside her folder, pulled out a single document, and held it up. Not for drama, but for clarity. The paper was clean, uncreased, and unmistakable. Do not circulate, internal draft. The watermark ran diagonally across the top in faded gray, the kind used in interagency files not meant for public eyes. Gasps didn't erupt, but they weren't needed. The silence was louder. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Aide after aide sat up straighter, suddenly unsure of what had just been introduced into the bloodstream of the hearing. Even the reporters paused mid-type, recalibrating the gravity of the moment. Jasmine didn't look at Green. She looked at the paper, and only the paper, like it held a weight no amount of shouting could compete with. Then gently she placed it on the table in front of her, letting it sit there like evidence at the center of a trial. This is the original document, not the one selectively edited and stripped of source data, she said, her voice calm, almost clinical. This draft was leaked internally weeks ago, flagged by multiple agencies as incomplete, unverified, and not intended for public release. Her words cut not with volume, but with precision, the kind that leaves no room to run, no wiggle, no denial, just fact, cold and final. She didn't embellish. She didn't moralize. She simply turned over the blade. So when we talk about facts, about what's real and what's manufactured, we owe it to the American people to be honest about which version we're using to justify policy decisions. Green didn't respond. She didn't reach for her gavel. She didn't even blink, because in that moment, she knew what the room now knew. She hadn't just been caught misinformed. She'd been caught manipulating, and Jasmine Crockett had delivered the truth not with fury, but with surgical force. The chamber wasn't just quiet, it was stripped bare, and all that remained was a document on the table and a lie unraveling in real time. The document Jasmine had just laid bare had shifted the ground beneath Green's feet. But what followed next didn't just shake the room. It shattered the illusion. With the room dead silent, Jasmine reached once more into her folder, slower this time, with the unhurried steadiness of someone who knew the storm was no longer approaching. It was already here. She pulled out a second sheet, folded 3 times, stamped with a digital header line unmistakably sourced from a government oversight committee. She unfolded it, held it between her fingers, just long enough for the watermark and metadata to glint under the lights, and then laid it flat. Her tone didn't change. It didn't rise. It simply hardened. "What's more concerning," she said evenly, "is that I have here an email chain confirming exactly where that altered draft came from." She looked up, not at Green, but into the space between them, where truth now stood like a witness ready to testify. It was sent directly to Congresswoman Green's office by a known political lobbying group, one currently under federal investigation, for coordinated disinformation campaigns targeting public education policy. The ripple across the chamber was immediate, no longer a shift. It was a fracture. Heads turned, aides whispered, phones lit up. Reporters looked at one another with the urgency of people who had just been handed the real story. Green froze, one hand still gripping the gavel, the other twitching as though deciding whether to grab the paper, deny its existence, or simply run from it. Jasmine didn't wait. She flipped the email printout to the highlighted page and began to read. Slow, clear, deliberate. Messaging strategy: amplify public fear, exploit uncertainty around gender identity, coordinate with sympathetic media figures to redirect the narrative. She paused. Let the line settle. Then turned another page, her voice cutting through the room like cold air. Use emotionally charged case studies. Do not cite original sources. Prioritize virality over accuracy. Green's face changed. Her hands, so steady at the start of the hearing, were now trembling against the desk. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Jasmine didn't look at her. Not yet. She addressed the chamber, her voice steady but sharp as broken glass. Is this what defending women looks like? Or is it just defending your political power? The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed like a closing argument in a courtroom that had already decided the verdict. Green stood abruptly. I need a 5-minute recess, she snapped, her voice brittle, eyes darting for an escape. But before she could take a step, a committee clerk leaned in quietly and replied, Request denied. You yielded the time. It was procedural, but it sounded like judgment. Something inside Green snapped. Her hand slammed the gavel once, then again, harder. This hearing is out of order, she screamed. The third strike echoed too loud, a thud of desperation. Security, she barked, voice cracking under the weight of unraveling authority. But there was no security rushing in. There was no order to restore. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And across from her, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't shout. She simply kept speaking, calm, precise, unstoppable. Because when truth finally steps into the light, even the loudest hammer can't drown it out. The gavel strikes had failed to silence Jasmine. The truth had already breached the walls. And Green, cornered, exposed, unraveling, did the only thing she had left. She screamed. I am the chair of this hearing, Green shouted, her voice no longer controlled, no longer polished. It came out raw, panicked like a fire alarm no one believed anymore. I have the authority to demand that you stop, she screamed again, this time pointing directly at Jasmine, her finger trembling in the air. But the room didn't react with fear. It reacted with stillness. Jasmine remained seated, composed, her hands folded atop the very documents that had just detonated the illusion of Green's control. The microphones caught everything, every ragged breath, every syllable distorted by fury. Green's voice, once the centerpiece of the chamber, was now out of tune, frantic, and cracking beneath the weight of the truth she could no longer contain. Her gavel hung limp in her hand, lifted but powerless. Even her own party sat motionless. No one moved to support her. No one echoed her cry. Because in that moment, it was clear. Green wasn't leading. She was breaking. The woman who had walked in prepared to dominate the stage was now clawing to reclaim it, and failing. Jasmine didn't respond. Not with words, not with a glance. Her silence was louder than Green's screaming. And that, more than anything else, was what shook the chamber to its core. Green's voice was still reverberating, jagged, unmoored, but its power had already dissolved. What remained was noise, fading fast in a room now transfixed by the woman who hadn't raised her voice once. Jasmine Crockett turned. Not quickly, not theatrically, just with the kind of slow, composed intention that made everyone realize the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Her eyes met Green's, but there was no anger in them, only clarity. And when she finally spoke, her words didn't crash. They carved. "You can hold that gavel," Jasmine said, her voice firm but never loud. "But you don't get to hold the truth." It was the kind of sentence that didn't need punctuation, because the entire room punctuated it with stunned stillness. Green blinked but didn't respond. She couldn't. The gavel in her hand, once a symbol of control, now looked like a prop. Useless, ornamental, desperate. Jasmine kept going, voice even, every word precise. "You are not the owner of this room," she said. "This room belongs to the people you defunded, the ones who lost protection because of your politics." She didn't point. She didn't shout. But the indictment in her tone landed with the full weight of everything Green had tried to bury. The silence was thunderous. All around the chamber, people froze. Not out of fear, but reverence. Reporters lowered their pens and raised their phones. Slowly, intuitively. As if recording the moment wasn't just a task, but a duty. A congressional aide shifted in his seat, eyes wide, breath caught halfway. A member of Green's own party sat stone-faced, jaw clenched, as if knowing the tide had turned and there was no swimming back. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need validation, because the silence said it all. This wasn't defiance, it was truth. And in that instant, it belonged to no party, no office, no title, but to every unheard voice whose protections had been stripped away, while people like Green clung to power, disguised as authority. The silence that followed Jasmine's words didn't dissipate. It deepened. It wasn't just a pause. It was a verdict. And as it settled like a heavy curtain over the chamber, Marjorie Taylor Greene sat motionless, caught in a moment she could no longer steer. The authority that once surrounded her like armor, through sound, posture, title, had evaporated. What remained was instinct, an instinct for Greene, translated into a simple, desperate act. Both hands clamped around the gavel in front of her. Not to use it, not to restore order, but to hold on to something, anything, that hadn't yet slipped from her grasp. Her fingers curled tightly, knuckles paling under pressure, shoulders locked. It was not the grip of control. It was the grip of someone unraveling slowly, trying not to let it show, but it did show, and someone saw it. From the back row of the press pit, a CNN photojournalist, quiet, attentive, waiting, lifted their camera. No flash, no warning. Just a single frame caught between two heartbeats. The shutter clicked as Green's head bowed ever so slightly, eyes cast downward, the weight of the moment visibly pressing against her spine. The photo captured more than a person. It captured the collapse of a performance. A woman who had begun the hearing with rehearsed dominance now looked like a figure consumed by the very gavel she once wielded with pride. The image would be transmitted within minutes, but its impact would last far longer. Green, fists clenched, back slightly hunched, holding the gavel not like a leader commanding order, but like someone terrified of what would happen if she let go. And still, Jasmine sat calm. Still. Resolute. The contrast was undeniable. Around them, no one moved. Aides looked away. Fellow lawmakers stared forward, lips pressed tight, unsure of whether they were witnessing drama or history. But the truth was undeniable now. The gavel had become a symbol not of power, but of fear. And Green's grip on it wasn't about silencing others. It was about not being silenced by the consequences of her own unraveling. The hearing may have ended in silence, but the storm had only begun, because outside those marble walls, the world was already watching, and the world did not blink. It took less than 90 minutes. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown, her voice razor sharp, her hands still, her words measured with surgical clarity, was spliced, captioned, and blasted across every major social platform before the chairs in room 2141 had even cooled. The edit was simple, a tight shot on Jasmine as she leaned forward and said, "You can hold that gavel, but you don't get to hold the truth." Then again, "This isn't your stage. It's the people's chamber." 10 seconds of footage. No music. No need for drama. Just truth caught raw and unfiltered. And it spread like wildfire. On YouTube, it climbed to trending spot #1 in under 2 hours, surpassing celebrity scandals and even breaking news from overseas. On Twitter, now X, it reached over 4 million views before noon. By nightfall, the hashtags were impossible to ignore. The People House. Jasmine did not blink. Screens lit up across homes, cafes, subways, campuses. People who hadn't followed a congressional hearing in years were suddenly watching it on loop. They didn't need the full context. They saw a woman stand unshaken against manufactured outrage and win. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow opened her broadcast with the clip. "In a chamber built to silence dissent," she said, "someone just reminded them who the building really belongs to." The camera then cut to Jasmine's line again, and again, and again. "This isn't your stage. It's the people's chamber." It was no longer just a sentence. It was a banner, a reckoning. Meanwhile, Marjorie Taylor Greene scrambled for damage control. Less than 24 hours later, she held a hastily arranged press conference in front of the Capitol steps. Cameras were already rolling as she approached the mic, but the difference was stark. There was no force in her stride, no command in her voice. "There's been a lot of misinterpretation of yesterday's hearing," she began, her tone defensive, strained. "This isn't about politics. This is about protecting the integrity of women's sports in our schools." But the script fell flat. Reporters didn't shout questions. They let her speak. Let the unraveling happen in real time. One journalist from Politico tweeted mid-press conference, "She's not addressing the document. She's not addressing the email. She's addressing a fantasy." And they weren't wrong. Green's words were rambling, her examples recycled, her posture rigid but unconvincing. At one point, she tried to laugh off the now viral moment. "People are taking one line out of context," she insisted, referring to the People's Chamber quote. "It's performative outrage from the left." But even as she said it, a young protester in the background held up a sign reading, "She didn't shout, you did." That moment, too, went viral. Fox News, once Green's safe harbor, offered only the briefest coverage. Their late-night anchor summarized the hearing in 27 seconds and then pivoted to gas prices. No panel discussion, no defense, no outrage, just quiet distancing. Behind the scenes, it was worse. Multiple GOP aides leaked that some of Green's staunchest allies were furious over how she'd handled the moment, and how she'd handed Jasmine Crockett a microphone and a moral high ground on national television. By the third day, the ripple had become a wave. A moderate Republican congressman, when asked by reporters if he supported Green's handling of the hearing, gave a half smile and simply said, "I wasn't in the room." Another, from Arizona, reportedly left a caucus strategy session early, saying he had no interest in cleaning up that mess. On the House floor, Green's usual circle appeared thinner. Conversations ended as she approached. Staffers kept eyes on their phones. And Jasmine? She said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't do interviews. She returned to her district, visited a shelter, and continued working on legislation around reproductive health care. When asked by a local reporter about the viral clip, she simply said, "I wasn't performing, I was telling the truth." But the internet didn't need more from her. The image was etched, her seated, calm, steady, the eye of a storm someone else had started. Her words had become a rallying cry, not because she yelled, but because she didn't have to. Memes appeared almost instantly. One featured a split image, Green mid-shout, gavel raised, and Jasmine seated, lips just parting to speak. Caption, "Guess who's still in control?" Another showed a screenshot of Green's clenched hands wrapped around the gavel, zoomed in from the CNN photographer's shot, with the overlay text, "Grip doesn't equal power." Political satire shows reenacted the hearing with near-verbatim scripts. Editorial cartoons showed a shrinking podium labeled authority, while a growing shadow behind it read accountability. But beneath the humor, the hashtags, the virality, there was something else moving, something slower, deeper. People who had long felt ignored by power began sharing the clip, not with jokes, but with reflections. A mother in Michigan tweeted, "I've been silenced in too many rooms. Jasmine Crockett reminded me it's not about volume, it's about conviction." A teacher in Ohio wrote, "I've been told to stay in my lane too many times. Today I sent my students the hearing link. This is civic courage." By the end of the week, Jasmine's quote had been printed on t-shirts, projected onto a digital billboard in Times Square, and referenced in 3 Sunday sermons across the country. Civil rights organizations began circulating it as a banner line for renewed efforts around educational equity. One group, the People's Collective, even launched a digital campaign titled The People House, organizing grassroots town halls across red and blue districts alike. The second hashtag, Jasmine Did Not Blink, took on a life of its own. It wasn't just a reference to her composure in that one moment. It became shorthand for what resistance could look like. Measured, principled, unflinching. Veterans used it in posts about speaking truth to superiors. Nurses used it in solidarity posts about standing up to hospital executives. Even corporate whistleblowers quietly adopted it, tagging it beneath anonymous essays. This wasn't politics as usual. It wasn't a partisan brawl or a soundbite war. It was a rupture in the rhythm, a shift in who got to speak and who got to be heard. And in that shift, Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed one person's lie. She had illuminated the machinery behind it and reminded everyone watching that power isn't in the volume. It's in the truth that endures when the shouting ends. In a week saturated with noise, cameras, and headlines, the most powerful moment came not from a microphone or a trending hashtag, but from a folded piece of paper in a plain envelope, slipped quietly onto Jasmine's desk. It arrived late, after the buzz had dimmed, after the headlines had begun shifting, after the digital world had spent days dissecting every frame of the hearing. Jasmine had returned to her office in the Rayburn building alone, seeking a rare moment of stillness. Her staff had left hours earlier. The lights were dimmed, the city humming low outside her window. She sifted through a stack of mail on her desk, most of it predictable. Policy memos, donor mailers, committee notices. But one envelope stood out. No return address, no postage meter. Just her name, handwritten in pencil, soft and uneven, like the writer hadn't yet mastered the curve of every letter. She opened it gently. Inside was a letter folded in thirds, lined paper with faded blue ink and small slanted handwriting. The words were simple, but they didn't need polish. They carried more truth than any viral video ever could. "Dear Ms. Jasmine, my name is Maya. I'm 10. I live in Alabama. I watched you on TV with my mom. You look like her, and you didn't let them stop you. That's the first time I saw someone like us not be scared, not be small. I told my teacher I want to be a lawyer too. Thank you for not stopping. Love, Maya H." Jasmine read it twice before she felt the tears. They came quietly, without warning, without shame. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the kind of tears that fall when a part of you that's been clenched for years suddenly softens. She leaned back in her chair, holding the letter with both hands like it was something sacred. Because it was. In a world where every word she spoke was twisted, attacked, or applauded, this letter was unfiltered. It wasn't political, it was personal, and that made it everything. She set the letter down on her desk, smoothing the creases. Then she reached for a pen. No staff, no speechwriters, just her, the desk lamp, and her response. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate, each word chosen not for sound bites but for truth. Dear Maya, thank you for your letter. It meant more to me than I can explain. You're brave. You're brilliant. You're exactly what this world needs. People may say you're too loud, too bold, too much. But here's the truth. You're not too loud. The world has just been too quiet for too long. Speak anyway. Walk tall. Don't wait for permission. You don't have to look like power to carry it. Love, Jasmine. She signed it slowly, placing the pen down as if sealing something far more permanent than ink. Then she sat in silence, staring at the folded note, feeling something shift inside her. Not ambition, not strategy, but purpose. The kind that doesn't come from elections or hearings, but from letters like Maya's. From the quiet voices who have never had a mic but carry the weight of generations in their small, determined hands. She thought of Maya's mother, of the women who never made it into the rooms Jasmine now sat in, of the ones who were told to wait, to smile, to shrink, of her own mother, standing on aching feet in nursing shoes, writing grocery lists next to unpaid bills. And she realized this was never about one hearing, one headline, one takedown. It was about reminding someone like Maya that truth, spoken plainly, could still shake the pillars of power. Outside the Capitol, the world kept spinning. But inside that quiet office, with a letter from Alabama and a reply sealed in truth, something more enduring took root. A girl had seen her future in Jasmine, and Jasmine, in turn, had seen her past in that girl. And in that perfect human loop, truth moved forward. The letter from Alabama had reminded her why. But justice, real justice, doesn't end in applause. It demands follow-through. And so, without cameras or clamor, Jasmine returned, not to be seen, but to make something undeniable. It was 1 week later to the hour, the same corridor, the same marble gleam on the floor, the same door plate, room 2141, Committee on Oversight. But the atmosphere had shifted. The air was thinner now, as if the building itself remembered what had happened, what had been exposed, what had cracked open and refused to be sealed shut again. Jasmine Crockett entered alone. No press releases, no podium, no armor, just a manila folder tucked under her arm and a quiet fire in her step. The Capitol buzzed around her, but like passing wind. Her silence turned heads more than a press swarm ever could. Clerks whispered as she passed. A few aides stood straighter, unsure whether to greet her or give her space. She needed neither. Her focus was locked, her presence magnetic in its restraint. On her shoulder, a navy coat draped unbuttoned, and beneath it, a sharp-cut charcoal suit. Not flashy, not dulled. Just deliberate. Just enough. In her left hand, that same folder, the one that had lived in headlines for a week. Except this time, it held not evidence, but action. Inside the folder was a petition, no theatrics, just ink and signatures. Addressed to the House Committee on Ethics and Oversight. Subject: Request for formal investigation into the deliberate use of unverified and altered government documents during the October oversight hearing. The language was calm, legal, measured, but the subtext was fire. Jasmine wasn't appealing for attention, she was demanding consequence. And behind her words were 28 signatures, 7 of which belonged to Republican colleagues who had since quietly stepped away from Green's orbit. They didn't announce it, but they signed. Jasmine never mentioned their names. She didn't have to. She approached the clerk's desk with the kind of stillness that made noise unnecessary. The young assistant behind the counter looked up, clearly caught off guard. Jasmine nodded once. No smile, no ice, just presence. For the committee chair, she said simply, sliding the folder across the polished oak. The clerk reached for it, fumbled slightly, caught by the sudden weight of something bigger than it looked. Before the woman could stammer a question, Jasmine had already turned. But instead of heading for the exit, she did something else. She walked toward room 2141. The chamber door was closed, locked, no session scheduled. but its presence loomed like a monument. Jasmine stopped in front of it, just short of touching the handle. She didn't look around. She didn't pose. She simply stood there, one breath, then two, and whispered something not for microphones, not for media, but for the room itself. Justice isn't what you say, it's what you survive for. And then she walked on. No one chased her. No one asked questions. But a CNN intern stationed down the hall happened to be recording B-roll for a later segment. They caught the moment, the stillness, the words, the walk. Later, that 10-second clip, silent except for her heels and that single sentence, would eclipse every pundit's hour-long recap. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. The camera followed her, not fast, not zoomed, just trailing from behind. She didn't look back. The sun had begun to shift through the tall windows of the Capitol, casting warm columns of light down the corridor. As she walked, her shadow stretched longer, crisper, dragging behind her like a story that refused to end on someone else's terms. The light fell on her back, framing her not as a spectacle, but as a silhouette of intent. Staffers moved to the side instinctively, not out of reverence, but out of understanding. One older man, gray at the temples, tie slightly loosened, watched from a distance, then whispered to a colleague, "That's what courage looks like when it's not looking for credit." A woman seated nearby dabbed at the corner of her eye. "She came back," she said, "not to shout, just to finish what started." And that's what made the moment feel sacred. Because power in DC is almost always performative. It arrives in headlines. It feeds on reaction. But Jasmine Crockett had done something else, something rarer. She let the noise fade, let the cameras chase others, then returned quietly precisely when it mattered. Not to go viral, but to set the record. The petition would be time-stamped, archived, and forwarded. It would force a hearing, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but it was now part of the congressional record. A truth Green could no longer erase with another press conference, another gavel slam, or another distraction about woke ideology. This wasn't noise. This was a trigger, a filing with the weight of accountability behind it. As Jasmine turned the corner and disappeared from view, the frame of the camera held just a few seconds longer. In that corridor, the lights hummed softly, and the echo of her footsteps slowly faded into marble silence. There were no chants, no flashbulbs, just the image of a woman walking forward, with the law behind her and the truth still unfolding in her wake. And in that silence, America didn't hear a roar. It heard the one thing more lasting, a reckoning, whispered, filed, and now irreversible. The echo of Jasmine's steady footsteps faded down the marble hallway, but the aftershock of her stand kept pulsing outward, demanding not just applause but understanding. And that need for understanding is where every lasting lesson begins. Courage in the face of orchestrated hostility is not a cinematic surge of violins and spotlight. It is a decision made in the space between heartbeats, repeated until the noise around you finally breaks before you do. Jasmine Crockett's calm, her refusal to let volume dictate validity, reminded a nation that power rooted in spectacle collapses when confronted by power rooted in substance. She did not meet rage with rage. She met it with documentation, with chain of custody stamps, with highlighted paragraphs that could outlive every decibel in that room. The injustice she confronted, race, gender, systemic erasure, expected her to perform either fury or defeat, because those narratives are easier to dismiss. Instead, she performed due process, verifying sources, citing statutes, forcing the gavel to justify itself. In doing so, she flipped the psychological script, making Green's weapons, fake documents and louder lungs, look less like authority and more like panic. This is lesson one. When confronted by manufactured outrage, slow the tempo. Make the moment last long enough for the lie to decay in real time. That tempo shift is where truth survives its first assault. Yet courage alone is not the measure. It is the precision with which that courage is deployed. Jasmine's silence, that unnervingly steady silence, proved that restraint can be an offensive tactic, not a defensive posture. By refusing to interrupt, she let Green's rhetoric burn through its fuel unchecked, exposing its own contradictions. When the forged confidential stamp finally arrived, the audience had already witnessed a dozen smaller cracks, and the big rupture felt inevitable, earned, damning. The injustice at play counted on adrenaline to muddy the evidence. Jasmine turned adrenaline into a lens, cooling the room, sharpening the focus, forcing every camera to zoom where it belonged. This is lesson 2. When liars bet on chaos, give them silence long enough to drown in their own echoes. Let their story fold under the weight of its missing footnotes. And when you finally speak, speak with receipts, because a receipt is louder than any microphone. The third lesson rises from the ashes of every gavel Green slammed. Positional power is brittle when separated from moral power. Titles, podiums, gavels, they project strength, but they do not generate it. The House hearings showed exactly how quickly authority unravels when its legitimacy is exposed as theater. Green's authority was performative, built on the assumption that most people won't double-check a confident lie. Jasmine's authority was procedural, evidentiary, patient. She weaponized the rules that were meant to silence her, forcing them to protect her instead. This is the fulcrum of systemic change. Learn the mechanisms so well that you can reverse their pressure, bending the institution toward people it once crushed. Injustice thrives on exploited ignorance. Dismantle that ignorance, and injustice becomes a paper tiger holding a counterfeit stamp. Beyond the walls of Congress, the viral tsunami proved that society still recognizes authenticity when it sees it, no matter how scarred the public trust has become. Millions watched not because they enjoy partisan blood sport, but because they recognized a universal scenario, a bully abusing procedure and a calm challenger refusing to flinch. The injustice of daily life, bosses who shout, systems that stall, gatekeepers who misquote policy, mirrored itself in that chamber, and people saw a blueprint for pushing back. You don't always need a louder voice. You need an undeniable fact placed on the record where erasure can't reach it. Hashtags like the People House and Jasmine did not blink were more than slogans. They were shorthand for collective relief. Someone just demonstrated live, on C-SPAN, that the machinery of misinformation can still be jammed by a single well-timed truth. The cinematic lesson here is mass empowerment. One documented sentence can outtrend an empire of spin, and every citizen who retweeted that moment became a co-author in the continuing footnote of accountability. Power, once seen cracking, is easier to challenge the next time. Yet virality fades, paperwork doesn't. Jasmine's immediate filing for an ethics investigation transforms spectacle into jurisprudence. A critical transition many movements never make. It's easy to trend, harder to codify. By submitting a bipartisan petition, she translated emotion into enforceable scrutiny, turning a viral moment into an official docket item that the institution must answer for. This is lesson 5. Outrage without follow-through feeds cynicism. Outrage translated into procedure chips away at precedent. Injustice isn't only public, it's bureaucratic, thriving in footnotes no one files. By putting her allegations on congressional letterhead, Jasmine forced the machine to look in the mirror it built. Every organizer, whistleblower, and everyday worker can replicate that model. Document, escalate, formalize. Justice moves slower than fury, but once it enters the record, it becomes very hard to erase. The 6th lesson is deeply personal, stitched into the handwritten letter from Maya in Alabama. Movements survive not on headlines, but on succession, on younger voices who see themselves in today's fighters and refuse to believe the world is immovable. Maya's words, "That's the first time I saw someone like us not be scared," are an indictment of every institution that ever banked on invisibility as a strategy. Jasmine's tear wasn't weakness. It was a pressure valve releasing years of generational expectation. In that moment, she proved that vulnerability and ferocity can inhabit the same spine, that tears need not contradict resolve. For every parent who shrinks at the dinner table news cycle, for every child absorbing secondhand doubt, that single exchange wrote a new script. Courage can look like you, sound like you, cry like you, and still win. The filmic takeaway is that representation isn't decoration. It modulates what entire generations consider possible. Injustice loses its omnipotence the moment one child realizes it can be challenged. Seventh comes the paradox of silence. Speaks volumes if wielded by someone who also knows precisely when to break it. Jasmine's whisper outside room 2141, "Justice isn't what you say, it's what you survive for," could have been lost in the marble acoustics, yet it resonated farther than Green's televised tirades. That line reframed justice from abstraction to endurance. Not a proclamation, but a pilgrimage. Injustice often counts on short attention spans. It writes long pressures, hoping truth-tellers will tire first. Jasmine answered with a roadmap of stamina, showing that survival itself is a form of resistance, that lasting long enough to file the paperwork, sign the petitions, teach the next girl is revolutionary labor. Audiences addicted to instant catharsis must learn this slower thrill. Paperwork served cold can scorch hotter than any viral flame. If you want systemic change, marry the lightning of exposure to the glacier of persistence. Finally, Green's image, white-knuckled fists around a powerless gavel, thrusts forward the ultimate moral. The louder injustice screams, the more certain it is that truth is closing in. That photograph is a cautionary frame for every would-be demagogue. Propaganda is a brittle crown, and once the cracks show, the glare of scrutiny only widens them. Green's panic was not just personal humiliation, it was institutional karma, proof that the system can still recoil on those who use its tools to harm. Jasmine did not humiliate her with insults, she humbled her with evidence. And that distinction is the spine of democratic accountability. We do not jail lies with bigger lies, we jail them with provable fact. The cinematic energy of the entire narrative rests here. The villain is not destroyed by the hero's fists, but by the villain's own forged documents turned against her. That is storytelling rooted in civic realism, and it is a teaching text for every classroom discussing power, integrity, and the mechanics of change. The spark has been struck, the smoke has cleared, and the stage is now ours. If we step out of the audience and seize the lights before another counterfeit gavel tries to claim them. Begin where every empire of spin hopes you will skip, the ballot line. Register early, re-verify often, memorize your precinct code like you memorize your phone unlock pattern, and escort 2 first-time voters past every bureaucratic choke point because 3 ballots change an entire precinct's math. When pundits insist your district is safe, remember safe is just code for the complacency we predicted, and then dutifully detonate their projection with a turnout surge they will call impossible until the county clerk posts the final tally. Carry pocket copies of budget pages Green tried to shred, those footnotes about shelter cuts and research cancellations, and read them aloud to undecided neighbors while you all wait in the drizzle. If your polling place relocates at dawn, live stream the detour, timestamp the new address, post directions in 5 sentences so no intimidation squad can pretend confusion is coincidence. Volunteer for a local candidate who publishes every donor receipt nightly. Make transparency your litmus test because secrecy is the womb where forged memos gestate. After election night, audit provisional ballots like a forensic accountant. Then share the findings in plain language threads so even your least political cousin knows how many voices got stuck in pending. Democracy is not a Tuesday ritual. It is sustained public surveillance of every form, every count, every rubber stamp. If cynicism whispers that one vote cannot matter, replay Jasmine's 10-second clip and remember how one documented sentence toppled a fortress of bravado. Your single line on a voter roll is a lever. Pull hard enough and policy budgets shift. Outrage evaporates, documentation endures. Convert fury into records power cannot incinerate. Flood congressional inboxes with focused demands. Quote, Rule 11, Section 2, J1 verbatim, and insist on a hearing standard for document authentication, because staffers can stonewall emotion, but stumble when constituents cite procedure better than they do. Submit Freedom of Information Act request for every confidential report a politician brandishes on camera, then publish the request in every day of silence that follows, turning bureaucratic delay into public shame. At city council meetings, arrive with a phone on record, annotate the agenda in real time, and post unedited clips before you reach your driveway. Sunlight kills more disinformation than any fact-check graphic ever will. If you sit inside an agency, screenshot sketchy directives, store them on encrypted drives, know the federal whistleblower statute number by heart, and remember that leaking misconduct is not betrayal. It is the patriotism your civics teacher promised, but your headlines seldom show. Donate a weekend transcribing PDFs for investigative reporters. Your keyboard becomes a lance when it transforms scanned images into searchable text that lawyers can cite. When tabloids quote unnamed experts, amplify Jasmine's scalpel question, source, page, watermark, because gaslighting fails when the audience carries flashlights. Keep a laminated cheat sheet of your state's open records deadlines on your fridge, power banks on the hope you've forgotten the calendar. Make diligence a social ritual. Compete with friends to see who can file the fastest open meetings request. Toast every release like a birthday candle, extinguishing corruption's oxygen. Remember, paper trails are the arteries of justice. Clog them and the system seizes. Clear them and accountability flows. Movements built on individual heroics collapse at the first long night. So erect neighborhood watchtowers of vigilance. Form kitchen table, document clubs that dissect local budgets the way sports fans parse box scores, line by line, dollar by dollar, because the slush fund for the next forged report often hides under consulting fees. Rotate activism roles. One week you live tweet a school board meeting, the next you design infographics explaining property tax hikes, and the next you babysit for a fellow watchdog so they can present findings without worrying who's picking up the kids. Teachers, youth group leaders, and librarians curate mini curricula on media forensics, teach students to check a PDF's creation date, to reverse image search a chart, to recognize when a watermark is missing. Faith leaders weave civic courage into sermons, reminding congregants that integrity is faith in public form, and that silence in the face of deception is complicity wearing choir robes. Small business owners post QR codes linking to verified primary documents next to the checkout register. Let commerce double as a truth distribution network. Tech-savvy volunteers build public receipt repositories where annotated evidence lives free from paywalls, so no citizen has to fight propaganda unarmed. Mental health advocates schedule debrief circles after high-stakes hearings. Activism is a marathon staged in a hurricane, and burnout is the sabotage injustice counts on. Celebrate micro wins, like a city clerk updating an online archive, because momentum compounds when gratitude meets grit. Money is the megaphone of modern politics. If we don't aim our dollars at transparency, they will echo in the hollow chambers of disinformation instead. Pledge a recurring donation, even $5, to an investigative newsroom that sues for public records. Every invoice they file is another brick pried loose from the fortress of secrecy. Fund legal aid clinics that defend whistleblowers. Green's allies know that lawsuits can silence truth-tellers faster than debunked statistics. So bankroll the shield before the arrows fly. Skip one streaming subscription and redirect the savings to a tech nonprofit building open-source metadata tools. A timestamp algorithm can shred a forged document faster than any televised cross-exam. Support state-level candidates who pre-publish full policy drafts online, reward the ones who invite open annotation, and starve the ones who hide bill text until the midnight vote. Crowdfund public service fellowships for data analysts willing to audit municipal finances, because the next crooked memo often begins as a misfiled receipt in a dusty bookkeeping folder. If a corporation underwrites a politician's misinformation campaign, weaponize consumer power. Screenshot the sponsorship, share coupon-sized boycott instructions, and watch PR departments learn Jasmine's lesson in quarterly report language. At tax time, earmark a portion of your refund for civic tech hackerspaces because every open data portal shaves minutes off the next investigative expose. Celebrate corporations that adopt radical transparency charters but verify quarterly. Capitalism repackages virtue faster than snake oil salesmen in a gold rush. Let your budget testify louder than your tweets. Financial fluency is civil rights muscle in a century where receipts, quite literally, rule courts and feeds. Movements die when fatigue outlasts fury, so bake stamina into the mission. Schedule rest rotations, where activists hand off responsibilities like runners in a relay. Because a burnout activist is a silent feed, and silence is power's favorite soundtrack. Build archival media kits so future volunteers can leapfrog the learning curve instead of reinventing the wheel. Injustice counts on each generation for getting the last playbook. Host quarterly receipt parties, re-reviewing stored evidence, updating broken links, screenshotting again to outpace disappearing web pages. Memory is a weapon. Keep it loaded. Train successors the moment you master a skill. Gatekeeping expertise replicates oppression. When mainstream coverage fades, as it always does, create micro-documentaries, TikTok explainers, and podcast recaps that resurface key proofs for fresh audiences. Partner with mental health professionals to normalize decompression rituals, hiking meetups, art nights, silent retreats, because a healed activist outthinks a harried one. Mark anniversaries of pivotal wins with community service projects. Tie historical triumphs to present tense usefulness so victories do not fossilize. Finally, raise every child in your orbit on Jasmine's mantra. You're not too loud, the world has been too quiet, until it echoes louder in playgrounds than misinformation does on primetime airwaves. Because the only thing harder than forging a fake document in the internet era is forging a generation that refuses to check the watermark. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.